four wonderful comrades engaged in labor work across the country. This debate is about the Partyist Labor Strategy resolution. If somebody can post that resolution in the chat, that would be wonderful. The Partyist Labor Strategy resolution was a resolution that Marxist Unity Group and Reform and Revolution caucuses put together for the 2025 DSA Convention with the support of many others in the organization. The amendment narrowly lost, garnering 48% of the vote. It was a proposed amendment to the National Labor Commission's consensus resolution, and it almost passed. So this debate is organized and hosted by the Marxist Unity Group. You can learn about MUG at marxistunity.com. The participants of this debate were invited because they represent caucuses that voted in favor of the Partyist Labor Strategy amendment at the last convention. Red Star was invited because they voted yes on it, but did decline the invitation. All of these caucuses might have voted in favor of the resolution, but in reality, we all have differing views about what that means in practice and how we are actually going to move DSA's labor strategy in a more partyist direction. The purpose of this debate is to help clarify those differences, to mutually sharpen our politics, and to prepare for a larger debate around DSA's labor strategy in the coming months between supporters of a partyist labor strategy and supporters of the more traditional rank and file strategy or alternate labor strategies altogether. So, a little bit about how this debate is going to work. This evening, our comrades came up with three questions that divide how socialists, especially DSA socialists, think about the labor movement and what our party's role in it is. For each of these questions, our panelists will offer 5 minutes of reflection on their and their caucus's vision about that question. After each speech, members of the audience will be invited to ask some questions in the chat, which I will select and then ask aloud to that panelist. Those panelists will then be expected to deliver a brief extemporaneous answer. The winner of this debate, of course, will be the international working class. Debates like these are powerful because even though these four comrades were on the same side of the resolution at convention, we all have different views for the future of socialist struggle within organized labor. DSA, remember, is the organ through which the working class will seize power, but it is also a collective knowledge-building project for all of us. Of course, we'll be recording this debate, and we invite you to share it with your comrades who were unable to make it. So without further ado, we will begin with our first resolution. Thank you, Damien, for putting the amendment to the resolution that I mentioned in the chat. Lavender, can you introduce the motion and introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, so my name is Lavender. I use she, her pronouns. I am a member of the Marxist Unity Group, and I'm also on the steering committee for the National Labor Commission in DSA. I was previously a rank and file frontline library worker for AFSCME 3758 in Western Washington. I held that role for almost 7 years. For over 4 years, I was on the local labor council in the area, and I helped write and pass one of the first ceasefire resolutions that passed after October 7th. And I'm happy to be here. The resolution that we're first debating is a near-term goal of a partyist labor strategy should be building to Mayday 2028, and I will be speaking in favor of that. Should I start immediately, Sid?
Yes, please go ahead.
Right. And Sid said extemporaneous, but I wrote these up beforehand, full disclosure, my responses. But with the rebuttals, you'll definitely see me be extemporaneous. Yeah, I'll start. So not only would I argue that our near-term goal with the party's labor strategy should be building to Mayday 2028, but I would further make the case that DSA's most likely path to a successful demonstration of worker power in May 2028 is through a partyist approach that seeks to center DSA politically in the labor movement and to connect the labor movement to other arenas of working class struggle. However, all that being said, I still think that Mayday 2028 is a long shot, and that at this point it is unlikely that we will see anything approaching a nationwide general strike at that time. Nevertheless, I still believe that it's something worth fighting for, and let me explain why. Earlier this year, on January 23rd, the Twin Cities had the closest thing approaching a general strike that we've seen in an American city in decades. Thousands of workers took the day off, many of them taking advantage of Minnesota's sick leave laws, And they joined tens of thousands more in the street to protest and drive ICE and DHS out of their neighborhoods in sub-zero temperatures. All this on barely 2 weeks' notice. There's a lot we have to learn from what went down in the Twin Cities, and I'm sure it will be a case study for socialists and unionists for a long time to come. But I think there are some immediate lessons we can draw that are important in how we approach 2028. First, it was yet another example that it takes political demands to unite rank and file workers and their unions towards common action. We saw that with the George Floyd uprising, with the fight against the genocide in Palestine, and we saw that again here with the fight in the Twin Cities against fascist anti-immigrant occupation and terror. Another lesson is that most of us in it's something that most of us in DSA are already painfully aware of, which is that general strikes require an extremely high level of organization, not only in the workplace, but in the community to support strikers, to pressure politicians in the state to stand down in their attacks against strikers and protesters, and to mobilize neighborhoods in support of rent freezes, community kitchens, and more. It takes everybody. We only saw a fraction of the Twin Cities working class participate on January 23rd, and only in one city, although there were a smattering of solidarity actions in other cities 2 weeks later. This shows us how far we are from being able to organize a true general strike in a city, let alone across the entire country. But on the other hand, look at what workers are able to accomplish wielding just a fraction of our power. The Twin Cities forced the Trump administration to retreat and regroup. It was a strategic defeat for the capitalist class and their march towards fascism. And it shows that even a partial mobilization, like what we saw in Minnesota, can be a powerful weapon. And none of this happened spontaneously. It was the result of a conscious political struggle among workers, and the most politically activated workers led this struggle. DSA is the largest working class political organization in the United States. We bridge these different areas of struggle. We organize politically activated socialist workers in the workplace, at the ballot box, for tenant power, and in social struggles. And we do it democratically, and we do it nationwide. Because we are highly organized, we punch above our weight. And as we saw in the Twin Cities, the more workers are able to organize across divisions in working class life, the closer we approach the ability to pull off a true general strike. That's why we need to organize towards Mayday 2028 along partyist lines, building on our rank and file union organizing and connecting the industries where we have built the highest concentrations of DSA members. We can form a center of political gravity in these moments of general mobilization, not by fiat, but through our member democracy and worker organization. And even if we miss the mark and Mayday 2028 doesn't transpire exactly the way we imagine, if we organize along partyist lines, we will still find ourselves in possession of a powerful organizational network, not only to fight in defense of the working class during moments of mass mobilization, but to organize proactively for our socialist program. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to give folks give 30 seconds to maybe come up with a question if you have one. If you don't have one, I have a question as well. If you have a question at any point during a comrade's speech, remember you can put it in the chat and we'll come back to it later. I'm watching the chat myself. It's the first question that we have here is, do the panelists support National Day of do you, Lavender, support National Day of Action on the attack on Black representation in the South against the ICE attacks on immigrants and workers? And how do you see preparing for the likely imposition of martial law and mass opposition to the fascist state with martial law, maybe combining this answer with your thoughts on 2028? Are these connected?
I'd say it's definitely connected. I think that, the attacks on the last pillar of the Voting Rights Act, for example, being toppled by the Supreme Court, and the decades-long, centuries-long attack on the political rights of Black people in this country, it is a very important and essential arena of struggle for socialists. And as we saw in 2020, it is like probably one of the largest struggles in this country. And it has been since the country's founding. And it is, I think that with any mobilization or general strike that we will see, whether citywide or nationwide, it will be important to center the demand for Black liberation and the demand for a democratic republic with full representation and enfranchisement for Black Americans and self-determination. And so, yeah, I would absolutely support a day of action. I think that um, often we've seen uh, our like day of actions that we've called proactively be less effective than ones that are kind of forced upon us, which is something I hope we can reverse in the coming years. But I would like to see us continue to try to push that, to try to proactively, like call for days of actions around particular struggles and to work with existing networks and organizations of Black people that have been organizing around these issues for decades. Because, yeah, we have a lot to learn from their work.
I'm going to go with the question from Comrade Evelina in Chattanooga, DSA. It's how dependent do you think the 2028 strike is on the aligning of contracts as proposed by the UAW? For me, when I think of 2028, that's the first thing that I heard about, and I'm wondering what's on your mind.
I honestly think that that's not going to be the primary driver at all at this point. We've seen very few major unions sign on to that call, and I think that uh, what we saw in Minnesota was well, one, it was a lot of it was driven by the specific sick leave laws in Minnesota. But I think that like anything approaching a general strike is going to be kind of out of contract strikes that are able to happen because of the political mobilization surrounding that workplace action, which is able to, I guess, make it politically viable in those moments to take actions which previously union leadership would kind of tremble at. And it takes rank and file organization to pressure those union leaders um, to not back off of that, to move forward with that kind of action. And so I think that anything in 2028 that we see most of the action, I think will be it won't be because of contract alignment, even though I think it's about it's a laudable goal. I think it'll be out of contract fights. Yeah.
Thank you, Comrade, for your responses. Now, for our first speech against the resolution, we'll go to Martina. Please, of course, introduce yourself and your work. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. You're muted. I'm going to ask to unmute you. Now start over.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Um, Hi, everyone. My name is Martina. Um, I am here representing Springs Revolution. I've been in the labor movement for about 5 years at this point, both as labor staff and as a rank and file member. Prior to, I spent a lot of time in retail, food service, doing, those kinds of jobs that were very much not unionized. And I'm also currently a member of the National Labor Commission's Steering Committee and a member of the Labor for an Arms Embargo Steering Committee. Um, so I want to start by saying that I think there are quite a few points of agreement between Lavender and myself on this question. And but I think my approach to it is going to start by thinking about how Mayday 2028 sort of originally came to be and what the conditions of that mean for our organizing. So, as was sort of previously discussed, when Mayday first came up as a potential idea, right? Sean Fain made the call. There was a call to align contracts. And I think that created a certain or particular vision of who the kinds of participants in Mayday 2028 would be, right? Primarily members of the already organized, labor class, meaning the 10 or 9 or 10% of us in the US who are in a union already, who already have a contract. So people, for example, in unions like maybe UCW, where there's not United Campus Workers, where there might not be a contract to align, right? Might not necessarily be participating in the same way. And so I think that already sort of created a bit of a limited scope in terms of what Mayday 2028 could accomplish at the time. I think what we've seen since then is the Mayday Strong Coalition form out of it, which I am generally supportive of. At the same time, I think we should be honest about who is participating primarily in those spaces. And I think largely it is labor leadership and not from not from particularly many unions, and also a lot of the nonprofit sector that is sort of guiding the conversation. And so I wonder then at that point, what kind of intervention DSA would be seeking to make in building towards Mayday 2028, knowing that the space that's primarily organizing around it right now isn't necessarily where the rank and file is at, and is also sort of um, taking on or hasn't actually cohered around a set of demands that we can particularly name today. And so that's one point. At the same time, I completely agree with Lavender that there is utility in thinking about Mayday 2028 and organizing towards some of the things that might be necessary to pull off a Mayday 2028, which could include some of the things we're already doing, like solidarity schools, or entering into some of those coalition spaces and bringing our ideas about what socialism is and what a socialist labor strategy means into the room. At the same time, I think our ability to influence those spaces is also limited in its approach. Um, and so I think, Lavender brought up Minneapolis, as I was intending to do as well. And I think maybe we have similar lessons, but different applications of those lessons. So I agree that I think the primary lesson of what Minneapolis taught us is that political demands are what really cohere the working class around taking collective action. And I think that that's not just true in the US, it's true across the world too. And we've seen that in regards to Palestine across different countries. The one that comes immediately to mind is Italy's Blocchiamo Tutto, and some of the actions taken in Morocco and Belgium. And these are political demands that are cohering the labor movement to take collective actions like a general strike. I think that the same is true in the US, and that it will take political demand to get us to be able to take that kind of action. At the same time, I don't see Mayday 2028 as being capable of a sustained general strike. I worry that the majority of the working class, which is not in a union, isn't being courted in the way that it should be to participate in a general strike. And so I think a large part of our work, if we're going to be building DSA as a party and we have a partyist labor orientation, is to think about who how we can better reach people who are not in organized labor already, and what it would take to get those kinds of workers to participate in a general strike. And so today, at this point, to me, May Day 2028 feels almost like an arbitrary date that we've set for ourselves, that doesn't hold the kind of significance that I think it could have held at the time. Um, and it leaves us a lot of room to maybe think about, is there a better date to time? Is there a better way that we can actually just prepare for what it would mean when the time strikes for a political moment? How do we build, political consciousness within our unions rather than, trying to move us towards what will likely be maybe a 1 or 2 day event with some scattered participation across the country? I think there's a lot more room for us to prioritize the base building efforts, the different kinds of organizing within the rank and file that would better, prepare us for a general strike.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to give just a few more seconds for some questions to trickle in, and if they don't, I'm going to repurpose one of our comrades' questions from above. Yeah, I'm actually going to go with Evelina's question again because you're asking very good questions. Yeah, but so DSA is part of the National Mayday Strong Coalition, and the coalition decided to pivot towards election defense in the midterms, which is really like an event that is not really related to 2028, right? So, given that like these organizations, these forces are already capable of making these pivots, doesn't that mean that the 2028 demand is good and maybe one of the best things we could have just because the coalition is already pointed in that direction?
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I think again, like a question we need to be asking ourselves is who is in the coalition space, right? And I think those of us who have participated in those spaces or who have talked to some of the organizers of the Mayday Strong Coalition, there's not a lot of rank and file membership in Mayday Strong. There's not really a lot of unions in Mayday Strong. And so, I think we'll get more into the electoral question later when we have that third part of our debate. And so I won't, speak to that so quickly. But I don't see Mayday Strong as being who we should really be taking our cues from, I guess, is the best way for me to say that. I think it's possible for us to continue to participate in that space because there are, of course, some working class people who are engaging in the space, and we should be where people are. At the same time, I don't know that the Mayday Strong Coalition presents the kind of leadership and actual base of workers that we should be taking point from. I think we should be looking to the rank and file and not so much union leadership or the nonprofit sector and their orientation.
Thank you, Comrade. I'm actually going to now invert Comrade Richie George's question about, so even though a general strike might not be feasible in 2028, I think there's some agreement on that. Do you think that even taking a stance where we might be abandoning this 2028 lodestone will stop us from building coordinated, viable strikes through DSA in key industries? Do you think we're giving something up if we say this too openly?
That's a good question. Maybe. I think that you know, the work that we should be doing in DSA as socialists in our unions um, is going to hopefully be building workers towards militant labor action, regardless of whether or not that's in 2028 or sooner or later. I think that the role of socialists in unions is to politicize, is to prepare workers to understand that, their labor and their ability to withhold their labor is what gives us power. And so I would hope that taking 2028, that deprioritizing 2028 doesn't mean that our organizing around strikes or around militant worker action stops. But I could see a case for why that might demobilize or demoralize some folks. And I'm not saying we should completely throw Mayday out the window, but I don't think it should be the priority of DSA labor as we saw it be recently. And that, I think, to me, is where the tension lies.
Thank you so much for your commentary. We'll now move to our second speaker in favor of the resolution, Emma. And of course, don't forget to introduce yourself and the work that you do as we begin.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi, my name's Emma. Use she, her pronouns. I'm part of the Reform and Revolution Caucus. I am co-chair of UE Local 1010, which reps New Season's grocery workers. I've been working in grocery for 2 years, worked entry-level healthcare jobs before then. Should I just go for it? Hopefully. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, so I'm really appreciating this discussion so far. I think we're all pretty pessimistic, maybe, or at least cautious about where the general strike might be in 2028, and I'm happy to hear that. I'm not surprised in this room, and I think we do have to look at where we're at now and what is actually needed to have a successful general strike. I really appreciate Martina bringing up we have to separate the labor leadership from rank and file and kind of understand that analysis, because I do think that is going to be key here. And we can't. I don't think we're going to have a successful general strike, even if it does happen, if we just have a day sick out. I think, obviously the ruling class is watching us prep for this, right? There has already been retaliation for similar labor actions, and I think we should expect if something happens, there'd be more repression on this, right? So if we're going to do this, I think if we're going to present a credible plan to win, right, we have to get to a point where the working class is at a point where they're willing to push past things like Taft-Hartley, occupy their workplaces, stop disbursement products, right? And I think this has been brought up a lot, cohere around political demands. And I think this is where we are actually going to be able to cohere a larger group of workers than the workers who are organized in unions, right? That is why we see the political demands being so effective, is because that affects a broader base of the working class, not just sectional union interests. I think the Partyist Labor Strategy actually gives us a pretty unique understanding for this. I think from the R&R side, like we want a DSA to converge and be a coherent force within the labor movement and understand that we are trying to organize a movement that is much larger than ourselves, right? So that's why we have to be a coherent, concentrated force that work in conjunction with each other. And understand that the working class right now is angry. There's a lot of anger. We have conditions. People's lives are getting harder. And I agree, jobs in the labor movement should be politicizing that anger, connecting the economic issues consistently to the political issues, the social issues, and to anti-imperialism. Business unionists in general are going to want to shy away from that. They're afraid to make those connections. They want to constantly disconnect our economic interests from our political interests as workers, right? And it's our jobs to constantly not let them silence those conversations, not let them retreat away, but constantly be on the aggressive push and bring those conversations into our unions. And I think if DSA shows up as an actor that is known for doing that, I think we are going to start bringing like the trust of the working class towards us. So my personal take with 2028 is that like we should be organizing towards it, but like our priority should be May 2nd, 2028, right? We have to be looking at towards the long term. We have to be ready with analysis as soon as 2028 happens of what went right, what went wrong, present that to workers, right? And be able to be somewhat flexible with our demands, cohere what the organic demands are with the socialist horizon, and prepare long-term campaigns that are organizing larger community interests in a long-term fight, right? I think also something I know folks have been bringing up is like contract alignment and stuff. I really think that like we're going to have to begin organizing somewhat informal organization within unions because like I'll just say as a union leader, like most unions are not going to have their alignment, right? And there's fear of injunctions. So if there's union leaders that are pushing this, like we have to have, that's why the rank and file is important, right? The rank and file can make this happen. The union leadership cannot. I'll end there, but I do think this is a huge area of organization that I think we should be taking a part of. Check.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to give a few seconds for some more questions to show up. Thank you so much for that. So I think the question that I'm going to ask, right, is that if I'm going to ask a similar question to Lavender, right, is that if this movement towards Mayday 2028 or even towards May 2nd, because of all of our cynicism towards it, because of all of our skepticism, if it actually peters out and does not result in anything related on the level that people might expect, do you think we're going to be punished as socialists for perhaps overpromising, even though we know we're being pretty cynical in this room?
I think that if we are leading the organization and are honest about our worries and honest to workers about what they should expect, like I'll just say as a worker, like right now I don't feel confident leaving my job and potentially getting fired, right, for Mayday 2028. And I think being super clear with workers, I mean, I think in any sort of organizing conversation you're having with a coworker, you always have to be super clear about like, here are the risks, here's what we're trying to fight for, right? And this is why you should take these risks. And I think that is going to be part of this organization. I think generally, like, of course, they're going to blame socialists. They're always going to, right? So we're going to get flack. But I think as long as we are being honest, putting our vision towards a like longer term goal, right? I think we can build past it.
Thank you. Next question is the idea that if socialists move towards 2028 as the place where we are going to struggle alongside these unions, how do we strategize around the possibility that DSA organizes rank and file, the rank and file, and union leadership uses their control over many aspects of 2028 to push back against us? Do you think that this is a risk that we might experience by engaging too closely with these organized labor demands for 2028 general strike or 2028 contract alignment?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's why actually like resolutions like the Partyist Labor or amendments like the Partyist Labor Strategy are so important because we are going to have to be flexible and organized and disciplined with how we're reacting to things. If labor leaders are putting forward demands that aren't actually meeting the consciousness of the rank and file, we have to be willing to break with those demands, right, and provide a different poll. If it's all working out great, that's amazing. But my guess is there's going to be a point where labor leaders are going to break on some of the promises they're making, right? And I think we have to be able to potentially be willing to be the antagonist there.
It's a scary thought, right? Thank you for your comments. And finally, we're going to go to Alex as our final con speaker. Don't forget to introduce yourself.
Hi, folks. My name is Alex M. I use he, pronouns, and I'm a member of the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, member of the Seattle chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I think the point I'm about to make has already been made for me in some regard by some of the pro speeches who've agreed with many of the issues I felt around Mayday 2028. While it's certainly a worthy goal to organize toward Mayday 2028 among unions who have already undergone successful contract campaigns aligning their end dates with May 1st, the battle lines around Mayday have mostly calcified. It remains the case that the overwhelming majority of American labor, which is 90% of Americans, are still without a union, and they're placed at significant personal and financial risk from a strike that continues to lack the national support network necessary to sustain one. Even among organized labor, it's only a fraction of existing unions which have aligned their immediate goals toward a Mayday strike, with many, if not most, unions either lacking the rank and file organization necessary for such a task or even the internal political alignment to see it as worthwhile. To put it bluntly, we are far off. Numerous DSA members presently involved in labor have reported difficulty aligning their unions behind contract language around Mayday. Propositions of a mass general strike to politically unaligned or conservative union members have been met with either ambivalence or hostility. Class consciousness among labor remains deficient, with many members of established unions, especially in the South, often viewing unions as corrupt or self-serving rather than beneficial. A view which is regrettably well-founded in locals constrained by business union leadership, which too are less willing to abide by the militant strategy of rallying behind a general strike, just as they are averse to striking in general. Even unions where there are majorities in favor of striking, at-will employment laws significantly hamper their ability to fund those strikes through voluntary-only dues. Within organized workplaces that are unlikely to align contract expiration behind Mayday, the remaining alternative is wildcatting. I'm lucky enough to be the only member of this panel to have organized for and participated in a wildcat strike in my former union local, UAW 2865 at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The conditions of my union's wildcat were specific, narrow, and most importantly, resonant with the workers. We called for a $1,412 cost of living adjustment that aligned with the high cost of living in the city of Santa Cruz. But wildcat strikes are illegal by definition. Not only do workers put their income and their ability to provide for themselves on the table, but they further risk arrest and retaliation from the state, and in some cases, even the withdrawal of union recognition. The demand behind a Mayday general strike, at least presently, is much more broad. Do we want better contracts to come out of it? Do we want the PRO Act to be passed through Congress? Do we want the president to resign? Do we want the system to be brought to its knees? Is there a satisfying answer somewhere in between? The demands on the Mayday Strong website in the same vein are broad. Tax the rich. No ICE. No war. Expand democracy. Hands off our vote. I would go far enough to suggest they aren't particularly resonant for individual locals beyond those sufficiently radicalized toward national solidarity. And if we plant our flag beside these more vague demands and the strike fails to win, DSA will very likely lose out from that association. The labor movement in our country remains disunified, and for something like a Mayday strike to be successful, it needs buy-in from broad sections of labor. Many in labor don't even know what Mayday is or why it's significant. I'll underscore what my SOR comrade Martina said, in that this message isn't even likely to reach people who aren't presently unionized, which, as I mentioned previously, make up the overwhelming majority of labor. I think Emma's perspective on this is actually pretty optimistic relative to the reality. If we're expecting some level of involvement from individuals who share our vision but are outside of organized labor, it's likely to remain atomized and thereby less effectual. All of this only outlines how vast the gulfs are in education and class consciousness between different sections of labor. And it underscores our difficulty as socialists in convincing labor why this fight is so important. By aligning our focus toward Mayday specifically before we've done the work of convincing unions of the power of our labor to fight for political change, we're misplacing our priorities and failing to address the more foundational building blocks, political education, class consciousness, unified demands, required before a successful strike campaign can even happen. This is to say nothing of the hurdles that our political system has placed before a political strike effort, like the National Labor Relations Act, Taft-Hartley, and no strike clauses in contracts, all of which discourage unionists who aren't even convinced of the immediate need for militant, let alone revolutionary struggle in the labor movement. It isn't my intention to discourage comrades whose unions have already adopted or leaning toward those efforts. People who can push that line in their unions with the possibility of success should absolutely continue those efforts. But I believe the most pertinent goal for our struggle in the immediate future should be to continue to focus on educating our union brothers and sisters on the history of radical unionism, the capability of worker solidarity for revolution, and the desire for a society that reflects the needs of the workers rather than the bosses. It makes little sense to fight for an issue that is not shared by our unions until we have radicalized our unions to see something like a general strike as worth fighting for in the first place.
Thank you, comrade. I'm going to go to Julian's question here. So, noting that the Partyist Labor Strategy notes that the contract alignment for a general strike in 2028, the resolution's language says organizing with rank and file activists across unions and cities across the country to build connections and strategy in the lead up to Mayday 28. So, we've already agreed to do this, right? Do you think that failing to failing to incorporate this Mayday 2028 demand, even expressing cynicism towards Mayday 28, is in violation of the partyist labor strategy that we supported? Or when we come back to the table at convention with something like this, do we need to be distinctly more cynical about actually putting this forward in the partyist labor strategy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Far be it from me to promote cynicism. I think cynicism can be pretty destructive in the worst places. But at the same time, I want us to be realistic about what something like a Mayday 2020 campaign is capable of. Is it capable of massive political change? I don't necessarily think so. But I do agree that it is capable, at least in the interim, of being able to bring people behind the understanding of labor, radicalization of militant struggle, and understanding the precepts behind socialism and its orientation to the labor movement. Um, and in that sense, I think it is a worthwhile effort, particularly because it advances the exact things that I mentioned, the building blocks that are required for a broader strike effort to be possible. But I think in that vein, we shouldn't be approaching this from the perspective of Mayday is going to happen, but rather, what do we take from this effort to fight for Mayday, in terms of being able to advance the working class and the labor movement towards an eventual future action? That's definitely a question I think we should be asking ourselves, as we continue to learn from these efforts and build upon them.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Michael Donnelly's question here. So, and I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, right? So, unions, we all agree, are not at the point of militancy at all. But is it not, in fact, the case that Mayday 2028 is at least somewhat more politicizing than anything else? Is there a role specifically around politicizing Mayday 2028, or is that a distraction from the broader militant, anti-imperialist, and collective consciousness raising work that we should be doing in the first place? Does Mayday actually have any sort of role in there, or is it going to be a distraction?
Another great question. And I want to iterate my wholehearted belief that the act of striking in and of itself is inherently political. It doesn't matter what it is for. If it is something that can unite a class of workers, a shop behind a common demand to achieve some level of change, that is a political action, regardless of the individual reason for that action. Similarly, I think it is a good improvement that we're beginning to get into the habit of making political questions behind these kinds of strikes and coalescing a shared vision of what to achieve with a general strike. Um, for similar reasons why I don't think the working class is prepared enough to actually deliver a general strike capable of major change. I also don't think the Mayday Strong Coalition has united behind demands that are actually capable of achieving that change. Um, and I'm critical of not just what I mentioned from the Mayday Strong website, but also was mentioned previously about Mayday Strong reorienting toward a demand for elections. It's a very muddled perspective, and it's certainly not a perspective that any revolutionary socialist laborer would seek in a general strike. So I think, sort of to wrap around, I think we are capable of having those kinds of political discussions and political questions in our labor organizing and where we strike. But we, again, cannot put the cart before the horse. We need to be able to get labor to see its role in having those questions first.
Thank you, comrade. Just in time, and thank you for responding to the question in the chat. I am going to, so this concludes our first question, which is around a near-term goal of the Partyist Labor Strategy should be building to May Day 2028. You can see from our four speakers that there's a lot of skepticism about what these various coalitions, whether they're unions, the nebulous Mayday Strong Group, is thinking about. But it's clear that Mayday 2028 is going to be on all of our minds. And as thinkers around labor and political action, we are going to continue to need to figure out how we are going to engage with it. I'm going to give us 1 minute for our panelists to take a breather before we move into a second question on labor tactics. See you in a moment. I have been told by my comrades that we are doing brief rebuttals. If one of our panelists would like to give a brief rebuttal to anything that was said, please do so. Everyone has 2 minutes each. The four of you can stack in the order that you'd like to go in. Emma, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up something that Alex was talking about, like potential atomized organizing. To me, this is actually our role, is we have to create campaigns out of demands that act, and maybe not even the Mayday 2028 demands, but like we have to create organizational structures, use electeds as organizers, right, in order to filter the unorganized working class into a cohesive unit, into organization. So I think that is actually a focus that we should be looking towards, not just the organized working class, right? How can we organize the unorganized working class in conjunction with the organized working class? And I think that is a huge aspect of what we're doing. And finally, I guess I'll just say, like, I think if DSA just walks away from Mayday 2028 or steps aside or says, oh, never mind, it's not going to happen, we give up, I think that is a abdication of some responsibility as the left and of fighters for the working class. If there is anyone behind it, they're going to want to see us fighting for them. Check.
Thank you. We'll go to Alex, our con speaker.
Yeah, I appreciate the rebuttal from Emma. And I want to underscore that I said before that if folks are involved in unions that are currently oriented toward Mayday or unions that are capable of orienting toward Mayday, I absolutely don't think that they should stop that. I think that we should continue to be pushing for that where possible and where the movement is there. But I also want to say that, like, in terms of uh, putting the organized working class into a unit, if we are going to be working from the basis of folks who are aligned with us, maybe the question is not what can I do to make Mayday a thing, but rather what can I do to organize my workplace to make Mayday a thing. That's particularly why I think we should be taking a more foundational approach to these kinds of discussions. We can talk until we're blue in the face about what a Mayday will accomplish or how possible a Mayday is, a Mayday strike is. But I think until we're at that base level of organization, it's all going to remain hypothetical. And I care more about the immediate possibility of getting the working class organized behind unified demands than I am about what to do once the working class is organized.
Lavender?
Yeah, I'm gonna respond to a couple overlapping points from Martina and Alex. And a couple maybe that just Alex said. But I would totally agree that Mayday Strong right now is led by nonprofits. Only 2 out of the 6 people on this groups on the steering committee for Mayday Strong are unions, last time I checked. And I don't think that we should, I guess, give ourselves to the discipline of that organization over our own membership, at any rate. At the same time, I don't think it hurts us at all to at least be present in the coalition and to listen to what unionists in that coalition think. But I don't think it should be our priority over organizing independently. And I honestly think that we hold about as much weight as like that coalition as in terms of our ability to move people. Or and I would also say that about like organizing the unorganized. I think that the best way of organizing the unorganized is to organize the organized first. Partially because unions have the largest, I guess, banks for organizing unorganized workers. There is a lot of untapped potential and how much money is in those unions, and that's why the rank and file strategy and democratizing those unions is important, so we can actually put that money to work. And the last thing I'll say is, I think that I disagree with Comrade Alex as far as the utility of, I guess, a goal vis-a-vis like Mayday 2028 versus like political education or like more base organizing. I think that you can't have the one without the other. I think politics is necessarily teleological, like it's working backwards from a goal. You see this with how we organize a union. It's not effective to just say we need a union. You have to work from a goal, like say like we need a union because we need to solve this workplace issue. And I think that working backwards from a goal like Mayday 2028 is a great way of doing political education. Thank you.
Thank you. Martina, do you want to go, or you can give your time back?
I'll talk a little bit. I think that I largely agree with many of the points that were brought up here. I actually think I strongly disagree, Lavender, with the idea that the best way to organize the unorganized is to organize the organized. I think there is a lot of work to be done to organize the unorganized that doesn't involve reforming current union leadership or politicizing current union rank and file. I think Minneapolis is again an example of this. Like, Ewok had a training at one point, a strike support training during that time. And one of the things that was brought up when we debriefed it was there were no immigrant workers in the room when in those trainings, right? And I think that that is a sore point. Like our ability to reach workers of color, to reach workers who speak different languages, who make up a large chunk of the working class that unions and union leadership really don't touch, it should be a primary responsibility of DSA labor and of socialists. And I think that Mayday 2028, the resolved clause is should this be a near-term goal? And I think no, it shouldn't be a near-term goal. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything about it. I think, there are some elements, some structures that have been built around Mayday 2028 that are worth engaging in for the reasons that my comrades have outlined here. But I don't see it as a goal for us. I think our goal really should be doing some of those other things that I've just talked about, and many, many of the things that Alex brought up. And I won't reiterate them for the sake of everyone's ears and time.
Excellent. The commentary on organizing the unorganized is always going to be at the center of all of our political work. I'm going to give everyone just a minute, maybe to grab some water, and they'll be back at 7:24. Be fast. All right, it's 7:24. Alex and Martina, hope you're back because Alex will be introducing our second resolution.
Thank you, comrade. The second resolution that I'll be arguing in favor of is socialists should not lead fights for higher wages. I actually think I'm probably going to disappoint a little bit in how I respond to this question. I actually have no issues with socialists leading the effort for higher wage, but my response is to ask how we want to characterize the relationship of this question to socialism in a partyist sense, specifically socialists who are defined by their participation in an organized socialist party. And the question of driving unions from an inside-outside partyist perspective is something I'm more skeptical of. I think our main role as political radicals, as I mentioned before, is to educate existing labor members into socialist organizers who are cognizant of labor's roots and willing to fight for strong contract demands outside of our own participation. It is by building that political orientation through deliberate, thoughtful, and critical engagement with the issues they're most likely to directly face that we can achieve that vision. This is exactly the approach that underscored the Wildcat strike I was a part of at UCSC, which played a big part of radicalizing me to a broader socialist organization. As much as we may not gel with the more individualized understanding of labor demands that plagues American labor, which will continue to be a hurdle for organizers seeking to build radical unions in solidarity, it is, as Lavender said, the drive behind major demands that carries the potential for radicalization. Unfortunately for Mayday, the demands for that action are not so immediate. However, the demand for higher wages is and always will be important, at least until money is abolished. So I think my general question here is if we're going to be involved in unions advocating for higher wages, is the change going to happen if the only people doing the advocacy within those unions are actively members of a socialist party? Or is it going to be stronger if we are more capable as union members in educating other members of our union who may not be aligned with an organization or affiliated with an organization or party like DSA, to begin to realize that same vision for themselves and start leading those charges as their own organizers? Um, I think our role as DSA, particularly how we approach union organization and union radicalization, should be leading from the back rather than the fore. We should be giving the drive, the revolutionary drive within unions to see a better future for themselves, to convince them that the demands that they seek are worth it, and to empower them to seek a broader political vision out of the immediate changes that are capable of enacting within their workplaces. I'm really encouraged by the development of the Starbucks Workers United Union, which has not only amplified its own power through major nationwide demands for solidarity among Starbucks workers, but have seen fit to turn those demands into political action. They've been pretty consistently pro-LGBT. They've been pretty consistently anti-genocide and pro-Palestine. And they've been very good at unifying their union activities, which still seek recognition of their union by Starbucks corporate, with the immediate political struggles of our time. And that's something that has happened, I think, ideally, in that sense. DSA members have been deeply involved with Starbucks Workers United, and there is a heavy overlap between Starbucks Workers United and DSA membership, but it isn't necessarily something that DSA is inherently driving. It is something where DSA has taken an active role in how we've been engaging and how we've been showing solidarity, showing up to picket lines, helping fund strike efforts, that sort of thing, that have implicitly improved the union's own capacity to organize in and of itself. And I think we can build on that really successful model in how we approach unions from a partyist perspective. I think we can learn from those successes and not necessarily try to use a party to co-opt union leadership and solidify it behind our political goals as DSA, but rather to grant them a shared perspective, a shared radicalization, a shared political consciousness that they can use to see their own potential and their own power. And in that sense, I think governing like a party rather than as a party is a more effective strategy. And we can definitely learn from how we've approached the Democratic Party as DSA with how we approach unions in the same vein.
Thank you, comrade, for your speech. So my question is like, okay, party. Yeah, we're a party, but like parties do things. And the thing that people we do that people like is people like money. Isn't like we all like money here, right? Yeah, I thought so. Um, so is thank you, Nora. Is the fact that like we are maybe not thinking about leading fights for higher wages, isn't that just going to like cede that terrain, that super, super important terrain to like somebody that is less socialist or less competent than us?
That's a great question. My answer is if any one DSA member is leading a campaign for higher wages, that may betray some weakness in the union itself in not having more voices to lead with. And I definitely think it is it can be a problem, really, if DSA is the only faction within labor that is actively leading these struggles. I think a big strength of DSA is in our ability to form coalitions. And it may not just be between DSA and unions. It may be between DSA uh, and other organizations or factions or reform caucuses that are currently working within unions to improve how the union is governed and how it orients behind contract demands. I think there's something to consider there. I think there's a common thing that I've seen at picket lines where a revolutionary socialist party, like say the Spartacist League, for instance, shows up to the picket line with newspapers and talks about how the activity of the workers is really well spent building a vanguard party. I don't think that's specific to workers' immediate issues, and it also doesn't speak to workers actively involved in those conversations. And that's more what I want to focus this discussion on.
Thank you. Give a few more seconds for people to specifically come up with a question on the topic of wages and the fight for higher wages specifically. Newspapers are the most cringe thing a leftist can hand anyone. So, yeah, I think Sean's question is interesting, right? Should unions instead argue for other non or more tangible non-wage wins? One could call these maybe political demands, even shorter work days, weeks without reduction in annual pay, more days off. Does do Alex, do you see that as different than arguing for higher wages or potentially more politicizing or more party-like?
I think it depends on the union. Different unions will have different issues that are more pertinent to them. Maybe one union has a really, really low wage relative to their industry. Maybe a different union has to deal with working in the sun all the time and doesn't get as many resources for heat stroke from their workplace. All these demands are really going to be specific to each individual union. And I think that is kind of the approach that we should be taking as socialists and asking, well, what does a union really seek? What are union members really facing? And it can be from any litany of things specific to each individual shop. And I think that just underscores the fact that we can't be the ones imposing these expectations. We should be able to frame the question of what is a better version of our workplace that we're capable of envisioning. Ask, union members what they're involved in. Follow the secrets of a successful organizer. You know, um, and I think by centering the demands that workers are actively facing, we stand a greater chance of radicalizing labor toward socialist aligned ideals than we do by having our own idea of what to push for as socialists from an independent perspective and saying that laborers have to share that. So, yeah, I think it's a very important way to frame this conversation.
Thank you, comrade. We'll now go to Emma as the first con speaker.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a you threw me for there's a twist there, Alex. That was interesting. Yeah, I totally think we should fight for more wages. I want to be paid more. Most people I know want to be paid more. Also just say for like folks who are facing like institutional violence, like economic issues are going to disproportionately affect them in both negative and positive ways, right? I think framing the discussion around like leading from the back with this stuff is interesting, and I do think I would disagree with it. So I'm glad you brought that forward. I think we should be the best fighters for wages, and I think generally socialists are willing to do things to get higher wages that business unionists are not. Business unionists are getting paid either way, right? They're just fighting for the wage that keeps them in office, right? We're fighting for the wage that the best wage we can get with the leverage we hold, right? And if we're willing to go on strike, if we're willing to pursue more militant actions, we're going to be able to win a higher wage. I also think that, like, okay, I want to address something because I think this is kind of a misconception, at least from my standpoint, about the Partyist Labor Strategy, about like co-opting union leadership or trying to take control of unions. I agree with the perspective of no, we should be trying to create a shared political vision with more people who are not also in DSA and work with them, right? But I think by being proud DSA members and being active in fights and being the people who are pushing things forward, it makes people want to join DSA. It makes people join that political vision. I mean, I would say look to Zoran right now. He's winning material gains for people in New York City, right? And people are building trust towards socialism. People are understanding, wow, these socialists are actually fighting for things that make my life better. They're winning things that make my life better. And it lends credence to more of our more radical ideas, right? Of actually connecting the more political questions to social questions, right? I would just say, like, within my own experience fighting for a contract and fighting for a higher wage, like 6 months ago, the starting wage at my job was $16.50, right? And our union, while it's always been, had some emphasis around social issues, we've centered it around the base demand of a living wage, right? And by having that be the base and having us more radical socialist types actually be the front of that fight, right, for a livable wage, that allowed us to fight for things like when the boss started cracking down on Palestine pains in our workplace, we were able to do workplace actions. And, there's a lot of folks, especially folks maybe not in this call, who would say, like, okay, those strong political stands, they're going to lose you coworkers, they're going to lose you organizers. And I think we should be honest, like sometimes it will, right? But when we are leading those fights for higher wages, we won a $19 per hour starting wage in Portland, which in the Portland area in the grocery industry, that's the highest starting wage, right? And we're like the radical union, and that built trust with those coworkers, organizers who we lost trust with. After we won that, they came to us, they were thanking us, they were like, okay, I understand what we're fighting for now. And that was able to connect our economic immediate concerns with these larger political horizons. So I absolutely think we should be fighting from the front as DSA, leading that coalition. I don't think there's ever going to be a empty coalition for higher wages, but I think showing that we're the best fighters is always going to be promising for us. And frankly, what the working class deserves. Check.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the question that I have here, sort of related to Richie's statement about working on a wage fight campaign, is if we are socialists maybe who are not part of a union or part of a union that is not presently engaged in a wage fight struggle, how do we provide a coherent theory of wages, a coherent vision that allows us to build coalitions with unions who are waging a wage increase campaign, but also begin to think beyond just wages and begin to think of political demands? Is there a way that we from the outside can take a wage increase campaign and make it into something more?
Absolutely. I think the strongest way to fight for more wages, or honestly any demand in a contract campaign, if you're a union organizer, you want to be reaching out to your community, right? You want to be reaching out to outside organizations and involving them in the campaign. I think we've often had DSA help us with this, but we've also reached out to community groups for fundraising and stuff like that. But I think making it a wider campaign, and this is where I think like DSA has a unique area to like lead the labor movement in some ways. Like if we are able to push these demands for a broader base of people rather than just in contract, just say like, let's say a contract demand arises that we're able to push in legislatures with our electeds and make a broader campaign push there. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, is what I would say. So I think involving people in labor campaigns is always good. It raises consciousness and it makes us have more leverage.
Thank you. I'm going to go with Max's question here. What responsibilities do socialist organizers have after a contract is settled or a campaign is defeated, to make sure that an organization, especially one that is based in such an economic demand as wage increases, doesn't just disappear?
Yeah. I mean, I will also say, like, I think during the campaign, like, we shouldn't just be fighting for wages. We should always be connecting more of a vision, right? And I think after the campaign, I think, something that builds credibility is staying there, staying active, continuing to fight for those demands that we might not have gotten. I think generally understanding probably the limitations of whatever contract you won and being honest about those. And I don't know, like be a steward, like be there for your coworkers, try to fight like as an ongoing basis. Like the labor movement, like the antagonism with the boss doesn't end at the contract. If in fact after the contract is usually when they crack down the most, right? They try to get rid of people. So be the best fighter then. I think that's honestly almost more important.
Thank you, Emma, for your commentary. And now we'll go to Martina, the second pro speaker.
Hi. Okay. So much like Alex, I think I'm going to take a more nuanced approach to this question. I don't feel strongly that we shouldn't try and get working class people more money, but I think I'll start by saying there is a tangible value to socialist leading on wins that are legible to the majority of working class people. I think wages are one of those things, right? When socialists help to carry the fight for higher wages, that does build trust, and that's not something that we should shirk. There's a significant importance to that. At the same time, I think maybe the better question to ask is what separates socialists fighting for higher wages from business unions or labor liberals fighting for higher wages, right? Which is already happening, right? CWA, the Teamsters, they're always going to fight for higher wages. They're already doing that. So what makes it different for us to do it as socialists? And I think that's the real meat of the question here. I think Emma importantly pointed to a piece on tactics, right? That the way that socialists organize for higher wages could be the key difference, and that if we do so in a way that is deeply politicizing or that connects to a larger vision, um, or even take greater risks, right? Like do more militant action, then business unions are willing to take that is worthwhile and necessary. I don't necessarily disagree with that. However, I think that we would be remiss, for example, to let our priority in, leading fights within our unions be things that are just bread and butter issues. I think that as socialists, we are able to see the larger picture. And as socialists also, right? Like the end goal for us isn't better wages. It's owning our work. And I think that is something that, shouldn't be lost in the fight. We've been fighting for higher wages since the 1930s, right? And we will continue to fight for higher wages under the bourgeois state forever. We're always going to be fighting for crumbs. So, what can we do differently beyond fighting for higher wages that can also give us material wins for the working class? I think we would be remiss, for example, in our Amazon organizing, which I think is phenomenal and doing a great job, and I'm very supportive of, to limit the scope of our Amazon organizing to better working conditions for Amazon workers, like higher wages, and not connect it to the giant political context of Amazon within the modern day, right? We're not connected to the climate, not connected to the war machine, not connected to, all of the different ways that it's engaging in surveillance and all of those things, right? As socialists, we have a responsibility to not just fight for higher wages, but to take it a step further. And I think that's what separates us from, you know, the ILA fighting for higher wages, for example, versus, us as DSA socialists who are hoping to, guide some of what's happening in the labor movement. Um, and do I have anything else particularly important to say about this? No, I think that is largely it. I think it is largely that we should be fighting for a larger political vision. I also think prioritizing things like common good demands, right? Like thinking beyond just wages, because when we get higher wages in unions, in organized unions, that benefits the members of that union. Sometimes we see a trickle effect, like we did with UAW strikes, where then shortly thereafter they won. Nissan it increased wages because they didn't want their workers to unionize, right? And so that benefits a different part of the working class. But overall, the working class as a whole, the 90% of the working class that's not organized, doesn't benefit from socialists fighting for higher wages and unions, right? So we have to think a little bit beyond that. We have to think bigger. And so, what are common good demands? I think there's a comrade raising up healthcare in the chat that is like killing it, and I think he's absolutely right. Fighting for things like healthcare also means that higher wages go further because they don't get eaten up by healthcare premium increases down the line, right? Or fighting for heat protections, could you include a climate change demand in a contract? I think yes, right? It doesn't just have to be heat protections. There could be other things. If you're in construction, could you fight for using materials that are more, sustainable and eco-friendly? Absolutely, right? Those are things that benefit not just the workers who are in that union, but anybody who then uses the things that are built by the trades, right? That benefit a larger room than the people who are in organized unions. And so I think it always kind of comes back to those questions for me of we're leaving out 90% of the working class when we talk about organized labor. And we have to be thinking beyond that for the sake of bettering the conditions of the working class and moving us towards the ability to take more militant labor action. So I will end there. I think that's it.
Thank you, comrade, for a very sharp description of what you see the problem as. I'm going to go to Valeria's question here and thinking about wage fights as a meaningful counterweight to DSA maybe non-union campaigns that bring us into direct conflict with trade unions. I guess if we see wage fights being just so removed from other things affecting the working class, what exactly does a good wage fight look like from the comrade's standpoint? Especially if it can, as Valeria suggested, maybe offer a meaningful counterweight to other things where business unions might push back against us.
I think a good fight for higher wages could include some element of um, thinking through like, okay, we want higher wages. Um, we want some time back, right? To go along with our wages. We want to make wages go further. So we're not just going to fight for, $20 an hour. We're going to fight for $20 an hour and a 32-hour work week. And we're going to do that because the most valuable thing to us is not just the money we make, but the time that we have. We're going to also maybe connect the wages that we're making to other workers that are along the supply chain of things that we produce, especially if we're thinking about the trades, right? There are workers all around the world who are contributing and making things that then trades workers finish, or we're sending things vice versa, right? And so a wage fight here could also center an international demand around even a specific company that you work for, right? If your company has sweatshop labor in a different country, maybe you take that up in your fight for higher wages. I mean, and you bring that political demand with you so that you're not just elevating your boat, but you're elevating all boats. I think that wage fights have the potential to key in to to larger political demands because they are the economic crux of things, right? We're thinking about something material. We're thinking about the value of our labor, and so it does connect to a lot of those other political ideas.
Thank you. That's time. Going to go to our question document here. Um, yeah, I guess the question that we have as we came up with this is that it really does seem that the struggle for wages is one of the things that can build the most unity very quickly. is do you think that's true? Do you think that's not true? Or is that something we simply have to fight past? Even though wages might be the best demand, is it something that is best left to someone else because all of these reasons?
I think that they are the most legible demands.
Mm.
I think that most people, a large part of why people unionize is because they don't feel they're being adequately compensated for their labor, or there are other incredibly important legible demands like working conditions, safety, those kinds of things that I don't know that higher wages is necessarily more important than your ability to be safe at work. And I think there's, room for us to consider, are we debating wages just because, or are we debating wages because, there's a specific reason that that's more important than your ability to take a bathroom break? But yeah, I guess I think it's true that wages are generally a unifying demand. I think there are a lot of other demands that are unifying, and that if we ask better questions of the rank and file, that we will find what those demands are, and we'll have the opportunity to organize maybe more meaningfully beyond just basic reforms.
Thank you, comrade. That asking better questions is something that all matters to all of us. I should be asking better questions to our participants. And we'll go to Lavender for the final speaker.
Right, okay. So yeah, as people have pointed out, I think we're probably gonna have a lot more common ground on this one than not. But I'll lay out my argument against, which is I think socialists must lead fights for higher wages, specifically because we are in the best position to connect that fight to the political issues. Socialists cannot ignore or reject the struggle for immediate demands like higher wages. Rather, our job is to communicate and organize effectively in order to connect the immediate demands representing a subsection of the class, such as workers on a particular work site, to long-term nationwide and global demands like the fight for universal health care or the demand to dismantle the US war machine. The danger with fighting for immediate demands like higher wages only comes when we obscure the political, when we choose shortcuts and leave out the political struggle in order to organize for so-called bread and butter issues. That's a form of economism. It's losing the forest for the trees. And the most dangerous aspect of it is that it can appear successful in the short term because in our atomized age of neoliberal capitalism, individual workers are fed propaganda that if they should care about anything at all, they should care only about themselves or their families, that they should be grateful for crumbs, and that the cries of their neighbors are none of their concerns. The suicidal philosophy of I got mine. That's why organizing only around economic issues only sets up workers to fight each other when their economic demands come into conflict, which they inevitably do. But we would be making the opposite error if we were to ignore the level of existing consciousness, to ignore the fight for higher wages or other better issues. It's true that in many work sites or in some localities, because of any number of factors, workers have learned to go beyond these economic demands to want more. But this is precisely because of class struggle, because organizers at some point along the line took the time to connect the economic to the political. Um, and if socialists don't lead the fight for high wages, then others will, um, like reactionaries, like liberals, as we have seen. There's a phrase I like a lot, which is that dissatisfaction is the motor of progress. Capitalists love to preach gratitude and subservience because they want us to lower our expectations. They don't want us to hunger and dream for more. And it's the job of socialists to teach the working class to dream again. But in order for these dreams to be intelligible and not just nonsense, they have to be communicated in a language workers are familiar with. They have to connect in some way with reality as it appears today, different but familiar. A Partyist Labor Strategy would put DSA in the best position to connect the economic to political demands because by connecting the rank and file organization of workers in work sites and industries to a nationwide political organization like DSA, we are able to make direct connections between the immediate demands on the ground and the grander dream of a socialist future. We can have the strategic unity of a political program and the tactical flexibility for workers to build agitation around and carry that program out according to their own local conditions, to connect the economic back to the political, the shorter term to the long term, the local to the global. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give folks maybe about 25 seconds to add a question to the chat. If not, I'll ask one myself. Yeah, I think Anthony's question is pretty interesting here. Is that if the Partyist Labor Strategy is obviously at its core focused on shifting the conditions or barriers that make political demands more challenging. Is there an issue in the first place with framing the difference between economic and political issues, even if we do believe that socialists should be supporting higher wages? Is that difference between the economic and political still something that needs to be actively bridged?
Can you reframe the question, possibly?
Yeah, basically the idea is like we have this divide between economic and political demands. Do you think by supporting active and effective campaigns for higher wages, you could, by the very nature of that work for higher wages, be widening the gulf between economic and political demands? If a union shop that is engaged in imperialism actually does succeed in a higher wage campaign, does that run a risk to all of our other political work?
I mean, I think if it's not pointed out specific, like I guess it would depend. You said like a union shop engaged in imperialism. I guess it would depend what exactly that looks like.
Like a
Um,
weapons manufacturer, let's say.
a weapons manufacturer. Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, like, I would say specifically the job of a socialist organizing in that kind of environment should be to point out imperialism. It like you should not be organizing in that environment without mentioning imperialism if you are organizing within a weapons manufacturer. Um, and I think to organize for higher wages in such an environment without mentioning that, yeah, it doesn't it actively impedes the goals of the wider working class. Um, yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it's very deliberate, and who knows what type of situation, especially DSA organizers who might become labor staffers might be forced into to do so. Yeah, I think the last question that I have um for the con speaker here is that I'm kind of wondering about these questions of similar risks, right? Does a campaign supporting higher wages inherently advance some of these economic demands beyond things about who controls the shop floor, right? That if workers are again trained towards fighting for these particular economic demands, shouldn't we be supporting fighting the boss's control over our lives in general? Do you think winning a demand for higher wages poses a risk of our ability to win these political fights?
Not inherently. I think it's just about connecting like the shorter term to the longer term. And I think that that's a job of political education, of agitation, of how you frame how to frame the struggle. But so I don't think there's anything inherently about a struggle for higher wages that prevents you from building worker power or autonomy for the working class within a certain workplace. It's just about using political education to frame it within a larger struggle.
Yeah, thank you, comrade. So that is all four of our speakers for the second question. I am now offering the floor to all four of you for any of the rebuttals. You have 2 minutes. Alex, you can start.
Yeah, so I do want to directly respond to Lavender saying that there's nothing about the push for higher wages that would distract from something like agitating for workplace democracy. I actually want to push back on that a little bit. For the reason being that I think things like workplace democracy or raising consciousness of workers' ability to take ownership of their workplaces and bring them into worker governance is something that has to be explicit for it to be even in the workers' consciousness. We can't just assume that the workers are going to pick this up through osmosis by focusing all of our efforts on campaigns to raise their wages. Um, I think things like political education also are not going to be achieved in and of themselves purely by saying we should all get our wages raised. That more points to the goal for us to be more deliberate in how we educate our workers on not just the history of the labor movement, but their power, beyond just the immediate needs that we agitate for. Um, so I think this is more a question of, again, like, is this something that we are really capable of if we are the ones who lead, or is our power greater in how we teach workers and labor to lead themselves? And I think without that crucial component, we can't have the more radical conversations about what workers are capable of doing through withholding their labor. Um, it opens up the universe of possibilities substantially when you have more workers who are aligned on that issue than just socialists within labor pushing for socialist issues. It comes through articulation, it comes through successful campaigns, but it comes through explicit attention to those goals.
Thank you. Lavender, you can go next.
Yeah, I don't think we disagree there. Like I think at least on the first parts, like I'm definitely not saying it is wise to devote all of like a union's energy or to a campaign for higher wages, like without framing it within the like a larger like program of like a positive program for the union. I agree that that would be helpful. But I also want to respond to some earlier points. Some things I wrote down here. And I guess kind of coming back to I guess our disagreements about the unorganized, which came up again. Um, I would say that the only way to fight for the unorganized is to organize them. And I think that we can't really like they can't be represented until they're organized. Like there needs to be like a democratic structure there, which is organization. Solidarity isn't about altruism. It has to be about building a collective interest. So I think that building the unorganized, like organizing the unorganized necessarily runs through the organized. So that's what I would say there. One slight thing, which is I think that a lot of times this just came up in a small way. People misunderstand the problem with sects like the Spartacists. And it's not that they're political or they talk about revolution or they write or share their writing. It's that they're fucking assholes. Like that's the biggest issue. It's that they're not democratic. They're not listening to the people they're talking to. That is their biggest issue. Like there's nothing wrong with talking about politics as long as you like are actually listening to the person you're talking to and are talking to them like a human being and not just a potential customer. Thank you.
Word from the wise. Don't be an asshole. Martina, your turn.
Seconded. I think that there are a couple things I want to speak to. There's something you said earlier, Lavender, about if we don't do it, someone else will, and it might be reactionaries. And I think this gets at what I was trying to ask earlier, which is like, what does it mean to fight for higher wages socialistly? And I think part of this conversation is elucidating for me what I think the answer to that question is, which is that in organized labor, in areas where unions already exist, socialists shouldn't be leading the fight for higher wages. One, because how do we even make sure those wins are legible to the members of those unions if union leadership is undemocratic, right? If union leadership is the one primarily leading the contract fight, right? I think that the role of socialists in already organized places should be reforming those unions to actually be representative of the rank and file. On the other hand, I think when it comes to organizing the unorganized, that's where I think it makes the most sense to lead with some of the more legible, tangible wins, like fighting for higher wages and then increasing political consciousness through some of those fights, but not necessarily in existing unions themselves. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in existing unions to actually make socialists leading a fight even visible. And then lastly, not to steal Alex's anarcho thunder, but I do think that the unorganized don't necessarily need to be formally organized to be successful in winning demands. And I think that we have seen worker associations do that before.
Thank you, comrade. And we'll end with Emma.
Cool. Yeah. So this has been an interesting conversation. There's a couple things that I think have been common themes. And I guess first of all, I think just to sum up, like we all voted for the Partyist Labor Strategy, right? And I think a huge key of that I think we all agree with is like we cannot, as socialists, our job is not to allow the economic demands to be separated from the political demands. I think we're all on the same page with that, right? So I think whenever we're fighting for higher wages, we're also fighting for workplace control. We're also fighting for political demands. And these are all part of the same fight. What I think is a disagreement I have is about how we're engaging with the unorganized working class, right? And at the risk of sounding like someone who hands out newspapers, I think we have to talk about like being the vanguard of the working class and like who is on the front lines fighting for class interests, right? And like obviously, so we wanted socialists on the front lines fighting for class interests, but like the people who are actually engaged in class warfare, like in a tangible way in the working class, is often like the organized working class, like on a very technical level. Like maybe not, we're not saying they're our heroes, but like if you're fighting your boss, you are engaging in class warfare. And I think that's why I was talking about how we're fighting for these demands is so important. There's a recent book or blog put out where he was talking about like where do labor organizers get inspiration, and the highest category was seeing other labor actions. That's why like building towards a strike is the most important thing we can do. The labor movement is afraid to do strikes. Labor leaders are afraid to do strikes. Socialists will win more. That's our best point of leverage. That's how we win higher wages. If we push towards strikes, that's how we make a more democratic union. And I also think like if we look towards American history, like the CIO created a strike wave that made a lot of unionization happen. Thanks, check.
Thank you, comrades. That was the end of our second question, so I'm going to take another couple minutes. Strike calisthenics, I love that. We've got to exercise that muscle. And we'll come back at 8:06. See you in a moment. All right, we are now at 8:08, and we are going to our final question of the evening. And as someone that is mostly involved in electoral work in DSA, it is my favorite of these three questions. And we are going to ask Emma, if you can introduce it.
Yes. Oh, I don't have the text up right in front of me, but I
Oh,
think it's the
let me do
vibe
it
of.
then.
Thank you.
Resolved, DSA's labor and electoral strategy must be brought closer together.
Thanks.
And you can begin.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm really excited to discuss this. I think this is where the greatest potential of the Partyist Labor Strategy actually is. And I hope that I, in the future we can have discussions with the folks who voted against the Partyist Labor Strategy. I think that would provide a very productive conversation that would allow us to move forward, because I do think there is probably some points of unity here across caucuses, right? And I think generally, I'm biased as a labor organizer. I think electoral mostly needs to move towards the labor movement. But I think there are ways that our labor organizing can learn from our electoral organizing. For instance, I think a lot of comrades in DSA have brought up the idea of bringing the SEIOC structure into labor organizing. I know I'm not the only elected DSA labor leader, right? And I'm in a small local, right? But I think trying to coordinate those folks who have to probably spend most of their times in their unions and have the responsibility of representing their coworkers' interests, right? And bringing them into a sphere where they're engaging with DSA. I also think running cadre candidates has huge potential, especially as a long-term and as part of reform slates, or to push reform slates left. And also researching how to do this in local labor councils and the AFL-CIO boards. These can be politicizing. Some amazing BNR comrades in Portland pushed the cops out of our local Northwest Labor Council, and that was a huge moment for politicizing moment in the labor movement locally. But I think the biggest potential here overall is bringing our electoral work closer to the labor movement and seeing it as a vessel of the labor movement. I think that, obviously we've been saying 90% of the working class is not organized in unions, and of that 10%, probably a minority are in unions where the rank and file are actually empowered to be protagonists, have a democratic say, and be on the front lines, fighting for their class one interests and being the ones winning, right? I think that generally we have to see our electeds as organizers of the unorganized working class, bringing those fights, the unorganized working class, in conjunction to fight with the organized working class. And I think there's huge potential to do this, especially in our most militant industries, service sector, healthcare sector, public and education, right? If we can time out contracts expiring, find contract demands where the demands that a certain union local is fighting for is a demand that reaches a broader section of the working class, not just a sectional union interest. I think healthcare for all is a great example of this. Fully staffed schools, fully staffed hospitals. These are things that are in the interest of the entire working class. And I think if we're able to time out with a contract expiring and a potential strike threat and leverage that the rank and file of a union can pose with a legislative push, with a campaign push, I think that could go a huge way towards changing how the working class sees themselves, if they see themselves as the protagonists of getting a winnable demand through seeing that a union, organized workers are actually making broader wins for the entire working class. I think that would really change how things are done here. That's all I got on this, but really appreciate y'all for putting this in the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Emma. I'm going to give about 30 seconds for some of maybe the electoral heads in this call to get their brains working. And if you have any good questions for Emma. I'm going to give 20 more seconds, and if not, I'm going to ask a question that only a truly self-hating electoralist like myself could come up with. Yeah, I think I'll think of that, right? I mean, a lot of organized workers have this idea of unions good, politicians bad. And we've seen throughout, especially in New York City DSA, for example, that the electoral sphere is prone to highly public compromises, even when socialists do things that are cool. In fact, prone to highly public compromises with the capitalist class, even when labor unions are equally capable of doing the same thing and get much less flack for it. Regardless of how reformist or liquidationist an individual union or electoral project is, do you think that any project like this is going to have to mean that union organizers are going to have to get over the stink of electoral politics? Is that even worth it?
I'm really glad you brought this up. We're actually having issues in my union about this. I think this is a huge question, and I think the way that politics have been done with politicians in regard to labor unions has often been politicians generally like dealing with labor leadership, right? And I think that in order to actually stop the or end the stink of politicians, as you said, is for politicians and electoral campaigns to be focused on the demands from the rank and file, right? If we see our politicians actually winning demands that matter to us and coworkers, if we see politicians helping us on the strike line, coming out to the strike line, right? These are ways that we're actually going to build trust. And there's a lot of reasons for people to be distrustful of politicians. I think most of them are very fair. And I think the way to overcome that is to actually focus our work towards the labor movement in the electoral sphere.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I want to go with John Harris's question about some American workers won voting rights before we domestically industrialized, and subverting working class struggle to representative politics have been co-opting class conflict ever since. How do we transcend the reliance on bourgeois electorally uplifted policy demands to win power for the working class? Especially, I'm going to add to this question, around the field of, say, labor legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally we have to be looking at, and I mentioned this earlier, like I think there's a huge opportunity for us to aim our electoral projects to work in conjunction with our labor organizing, right? If we can use labor unions and the power of, specifically the power of the rank and file, not of labor leadership, not of the money that unions have in the bank, right? But if we can use the power of the organized rank and file to push a legislative agenda forward, I think that is how we begin to change that narrative, right? In regards to labor laws, I do think that there are ways that we can like push against some of the like pretty draconian labor laws that are happening. But I think also, frankly, like we have to be kind of willing to push back past some of the, like as rank and file workers, we have to be willing to push past some of the limitations we have right now. And I think elected supporting any sort of militancy that does that is going to be huge.
Thank you, comrade. We will now continue with Alex.
Hey, folks. So I'm going to start my comment by saying I'm apologizing ahead of time. I will probably not be able to stick around for the entire thing because I have a SIOC meeting right after this. Yes, I am the co-chair of the Washington State Socialist and Office Committee, which also makes me, I think, pretty well qualified to answer this question in particular. Because I am involved in electoral politics. I have conversations every week with our endorsed elected representatives. And I think my answer to this question is similar to previous questions. We're not there yet. We're not in a position right now where labor currently sees their struggles as following along the same lines of our politicians. Um, Labor is very, very used to uh, this this relationship between themselves and elected politicians that is diametrically opposed or like destined to be continually separate. And again, I think you really need to get to the point of seeing everything as part of the same whole before you begin to have the question of, well, how does our electoral policy work with our labor policy? Um, you know, I will say, like, as many folks here know, like, socialist leaders in government are often the only ones who actually show up to picket lines actively. Like Biden was the first president ever to show up at a picket line, and he only did that because of the pressure being put upon him by socialists and labor leaders. Um, and he saw them as a constituency, right? Even that didn't go far enough. This is the one thing I'll ever be heard praising Biden on. But I think politicians like Sean Scott in Seattle, Bernie Sanders, even outside of DSA, other DSA endorsed candidates who have been running for office, Rashida Tlaib, have consistently shown up for labor when they've needed support and attention to their struggle. That's one of the things we can rely on as socialist leaders. But I think in terms of strategy, when you're talking about something like electoral politics, where you're working inherently with different issues than just a voting class, but also like businesses, coalitions, political groups, potentially blocks of leadership in the congressional offices or the offices of like a school board or a city council. Um, that requires a fundamentally different set of skills from engaging other members of your workplace and educating them on issues. In the majority of cases in politics, people already know where the battle lines are. They know who their constituencies are. They know what factions they're trying to placate. And there's a lot less to be moved once you've been elected to the halls of power relative to where labor is at and how flexible that is as a constituency. Um, so I think it would be a mistake for us to approach it with the same approach as we do electoral politics. There are different things. In many cases, labor is a lot more down to earth in terms of the immediate struggles that they're fighting. It's something that I think is probably the strongest embodiment of a direct democracy in the United States. And for us to be aware of the power that labor holds and how it differs, and in some cases is more pertinent than the power that can be levied by electoral politics, um, we need to be honest about it requiring a different strategy. Um, I think it can, in many cases, turn people off if we were to suddenly platform a politician. I want to bring a real example from what happened recently, or somewhat recently in Seattle, when a bunch of organizers were rallying for a uh, you know, policy toward immigration that was more sane, and the protest coalition in Seattle brought up Kashama Sawant as a speaker. She got boos because immigrants can't vote, and she was showing up at a pro-immigrant rally. Whereas, like a lot of laborers in labor are going to be immigrants. They're going to be people who maybe not be able to vote. Um, I think these are important distinctions for us to call attention to. Um, it's not as simple as saying that we can adopt the same strategy as we do within electoral politics within labor. We need to talk to people. We need to be able to build coalitions based on political consciousness. I'll finally end my speech by saying if you liked some of the stuff that I shared here, and you want to learn more about my tendency, I encourage folks to join LSC. Here's a link to join in the chat. And for folks who are tuning in, it is dsa-lsc.org/join.
Thank you. And of course, other folks make sure to plug your own caucus's visions here too, because we are really trying to share the political thought that goes around these. So I I think I'm interested in this idea that the electoralists, the campaigns, the politicians, are much more prone to liquidation than say union leadership and have all of these different demands. But it seems clear that DSA definitely controls a lot more politicians than it controls unions right now. Doesn't that mean there's something to be said about the politicians and the party and electoral politics just currently being much more useful for articulating political vision at all?
I think personally it comes down to the energy within DSA. Because frankly, like it or not, electoral politics is a site of struggle for different tendencies within DSA in particular. Unions, by comparison, are a lot more boring. You're usually going to be arguing for a lot of the same things, regardless of what tendency you're adopting. And it's mainly a question of prioritization based on your own political leaning, what to place that in relation to electoral politics, which is mostly DSA's focus. So I think it mainly comes down to DSA's priorities in this question. I definitely think if DSA unified behind a uh, common desire to actively engage union elections on a much more focused basis, it could certainly have a lot of success. That's actually a big critique I have with a lot of DSA's overbearing focus on electoral politics at the expense of other areas of organizing that I've consistently shared with other members of my caucus LSC. Um, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily something that's not impossible. I wouldn't say it's something that's not possible. Rather, I would say, we have to be able to negotiate union politics as a separate thing from the electoral system and understand the differences that make it sometimes easier, sometimes harder to work in either.
Yeah, I think the second question I have before you have to go to your SIOC meeting is we're in many situations where it feels like the unions are exerting incredible control over DSA politicians and are holding, say, for example, Zoran's feet to the fire in his refusal to support the No More 24 movement in New York, banning 24-hour workdays for home care workers. Is the fact that we can have a politician or many politicians that are ostensibly at least somewhat to the left of the unions, is that useful in like finding ways to speak out against the conservatism of, say, the business unions, or is there no hope there?
I mean, there's certainly a role that politicians, especially DSA politicians, can have in alerting, uh, existing laborers to the immediacy of their needs. And certainly, electoral politics has played a big role in my own radicalization, I'm sure many others who have joined DSA since have experienced. But I think as it pertains to present pressing union politics, um, the day-to-day issues that workers face on each individual shop and the unique issues that they have to contend with in each union are more specific, I think, knowledge than probably what's capable of being recognized by a politician who is not in that union. And I think there's no force that is perhaps more capable of addressing the issues that a particular union or union shop faces than someone else who is in that union who is familiar with that kind of struggle. That's what I think makes unions particularly unique in terms of organizing. Politicians, this is a conversation we've had with regards to the most recent New York elections. Politicians have a way of allowing voters to see something happening in another state over and think, I wonder if that's possible here. And it can be inspiring in that sense. But unions are a lot more localized. If a union campaign is successful, you really only can rely on whatever audience a labor-oriented publication can reach, describing the efficacy and impact of that struggle, which is, again, specific to a shop. It's a lot harder for you to reach other shops with that kind of messaging.
You're muted, Sid.
Thank you, and best of luck in your meeting. We will now go to Comrade Lavender.
All right, so I will be arguing in favor of this. I will start off by I'll leave that for the rebuttal. So I'll say labor and electoral strategy absolutely must be brought. Our DSA's labor and electoral strategy absolutely must be brought closer together if either are to be successful. I wouldn't say this just about labor and electoral either, but about every area of our organizing. Tenant struggles, abolitionist struggles against the police state, anti-imperialist struggles against the war machine, fights for Black and Native self-determination, and the fights for trans liberation and bodily autonomy. Like I said before about Mayday 2028, the more the working class is able to organize across different arenas of struggle, the more successful we will be in our general mobilizations. But the converse of this is also true. The further apart these struggles are, the more disorganized we will be, and the less successful we will be at bringing any one of these struggles to victory. And the capitalist class has no illusions about connecting their labor and electoral strategies. They do it all the time. And anti-labor legislation has been one of the most effective weapons capitalists have wielded to crush labor organizing. Look no further than the Taft-Hartley Act passed in 1948 after a wave of strikes in this country following the Second World War. Taft-Hartley is especially instructive here because it outlawed secondary boycotts and solidarity strikes. It massively constrained the ability of unions to unite across industries for political demands, for workers to connect their labor and electoral struggles on their own terms. Because the capitalist class knows how powerful we can be when we connect those struggles together, and how weak we are when we can't. Taft-Hartley was also a key factor in the rise of business unionism. It's not that business unions, like AFSCME, aren't political, it's that they're completely loyal to the two major parties of capital. They lack any kind of independent politics. And that's by design, through legislation like Taft-Hartley. If we don't connect labor to electoral, capital will do it for us. But we have to fight that fight without illusions that the capitalist state was built for us. Taken as a whole, it's a machine built to perpetuate itself in the rule of the capitalist class. But there are contradictions and divisions within that ruling class, and there are democratic concessions built into the state that workers traded their lives for in previous struggles. Those contradictions and those democratic concessions give us the ability to fight for reforms within that state. However, it is our job as socialists to make sure that the fight for reforms is subordinated to our program and to the revolutionary struggle in general, to the fight for the self-rule of the working class through a democratic republic and a socialist means of production, and finally to the abolition of class, to communism. As anyone who has fought a corrupt class collaborationist union bureaucracy, or who has been to the AFSCME National Convention knows, electoral politics is not uniquely vulnerable to co-optation or to reformism. And on the other hand, labor unions are not uniquely protected from being co-opted by the capitalist state and used for its own ends. Both struggles require an independent politics, which can only be articulated by a party that can democratically unite the entire class. As a side note, I will say that I would agree that DSA devotes too much of our energy to electoral politics, to the detriment of other struggles. But the solution to that problem is not to further disconnect our struggles, but to show our comrades that those struggles are intrinsically connected, and that our electoral struggles will lead to a dead end if they are not properly rooted and connected to independent, rank and file, and class struggle labor organizing, to the primary organizations of self-defense for the working class. That is one of the primary reasons why we are building a party like DSA and not just a bunch of single issue organizations. And that is one of the major reasons why we need a partyist labor strategy, because only an independent workers' party can unite the class along these different areas of struggle through our democratic socialist program. Thanks.
Thank you, Comrade Lavender. I think I'm actually going to go to Sean's statement and turn it into a question here, because I think it really gets at one of the big contradictions. Sean says, I think the sheer number of volunteers we see in electoral campaigns that are not affiliated with organizations beyond the campaign itself belies this a bit. The idea that it is very easy to get involved in a campaign, whether you are organized with DSA or not really organized at all, matters a lot here. Labor organizing, probably a little bit less so. Do you think there's a risk in the idea that if we are actively trying to bring labor and electoral closer together, what is going to happen is that labor is being brought towards the electoral, which is more accessible to the masses, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a danger. And I think that's why it's important for us to be like articulating an independent electoral politics. But at the same time, I mean, again, look at the state of labor right now. Like, labor is already in the camp of bourgeois politics, like very, very firmly. Like, you can see it. Like, I guess one of my first meetings in my labor council, it was like every meeting we were donating thousands to a random Democrat who didn't give a shit about us. Like, and that's just at the local level. Like, at the national level, they're doing that times 100. Like, this is already an issue, and it's an issue that we combat by connecting those issues within our party. And of course, we're still going to fall into the trap from time to time, but the only way out is through.
Thank you so much for your responses. Is that one question or two? I've forgotten. One. Ah, yes. So I think the idea that Valeria is putting forward is particularly useful here. So what does it actually look like for a united labor electoral strategy to provide a robust vision for governance while keeping electeds accountable to labor? And Valeria, who I know is a Chicagoan, has certainly discussed the roadblocks against Brandon Johnson's ability to govern effectively. Are we supposed to be bringing electoral towards labor, or are we supposed to bring electoral towards DSA? Are those in contradiction? Question mark.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's why it's important for us to have industrial sections in DSA to be able to democratically articulate what our members in different industries, what their demands that they think we should be pushing for in those industries are, and what they are pushing for in their unions. Because it allows us to show what parts of labor we should be bringing electoral towards and vice versa. I think without that, we're kind of a little rudderless. Like we don't, and I think we find ourselves in that position sometimes. Like we're not sure, exactly how to articulate which part of labor we should be aligning with. And I think we end up tailing reform caucuses sometimes because of that. And so I think that's why it's important for us to have worker circles, industrial sections, whatever you want to call them, organize masses of DSA members in given industries to articulate what our program should be in those industries from the bottom up.
Thank you, comrade. And finally, we will go to Martina.
Hey, everybody. Much to say, not a lot of time to say it. And also, this is the left labor debate, so I'm going to pretend this is a safe space. I think the electoral wing of DSA pulls us right. And I don't say that lightly. I think that when we engage, especially the kind of electoralist projects that DSA has engaged in recently and is going to continue to engage in, are typically ones that are viable and winnable. And when that is the case, that means that our electeds have to make certain concessions that they otherwise wouldn't have to make when we are running agitational campaigns. I think there's actually a lot of value in running agitational campaigns. And if our electoral strategy was more focused on that a little bit, then I would maybe be more in favor of bringing labor and electoral a little bit closer because I think there should be a greater balance. I think we should be doing both viable and agitational campaigns, and that would give us a little bit more room. I also think, to Lavender's point of if we don't do electoral stuff, the right's already doing it, the question of labor legislation, we should, I think, encourage us to stop fighting on stop limiting the scope of our fight to the terms of the bourgeois state. And I also think that when we are relying on the bourgeois state to imbue our unions with power, we demobilize our ability to build worker power outside of the state. So what I mean by that is when the primary thing that we're fighting for is, electoral reforms that allow us to organize better, right? Like the PRO Act, for example. I'm not saying the PRO Act wouldn't make it easier to organize. At the same time, that can be taken away, as we're seeing now, right? When that happens, where does our power lie, right? As socialists, I think a material analysis of where our power lies requires us to also think about, can we build power that can exist beyond whether or not the state says, yes, you can do that, or no, you can't. And if we are moving closer to an electoral project invested in winning reforms, then I think we are spending less time prioritizing building a militant working class that can sustain power outside of when the state says, yes, you can. I also think we struggle to keep our electeds accountable to our line, and that doesn't change. That doesn't change when we align our labor strategy and our electoral strategy. And I'll give you an example of this. Beloved AOC voted against letting rail workers go on strike in 2022 in favor of legislation that would give them 7 paid sick days. Do I think that was a good call as a socialist unionist? No, I do not. And I think that when we align ourselves with electoral projects that allow us to, that prefer legislative wins over building actual worker power, base building within the working class, that is bad for us, and it's demobilizing a socialist movement. Um, I will say, if you are someone who's interested in legislative or electoral processes within the labor movement, I do think it's a good idea for socialist unionists to make certain interventions. For example, join your legislative political action committee. Take hold of the processes that allow your union to endorse candidates, revise your candidate questionnaires, right? All of those things are good things that I think socialist unionists should be doing, and that could coincide with a clear electoral vision. But overall, I think aligning closer to electoral and legislative victories just further reentrenches the Democratic Party. It further reentrenches the AFL-CIO's commitment to the Democratic Party. And we're not at a place currently where we're really building a party outside of the Democrats. We're building a socialist caucus within the Democratic Party. And that's maybe a different conversation for a different time, but I think it's relevant here because when we're thinking about, what does it mean for labor and DSA to align, is that really a significant pivot from what labor has already done or not? Does it just allow maybe a better version of the AFL-CIO, or really what interventions are we going to make to change the AFL-CIO's affinity to the Democratic Party if we ourselves are entrenching ourselves within the Democratic Party? Um, and I think that I'm going to stop there. I talked really fast. Sorry about that.
Thank you for moving quickly. We're at 8:40, but I'm still going to give a little bit of time. Anybody has a particular question that we would like our final speaker to answer? Yeah, I think Sonora's question's probably best phrased towards a a pro speaker. But I also think that the question can be inverted, right? So Nora's asked about the party relying on electoralism can cause the party to try and grow its tent and dilute its revolutionary drive zeal. Martina, do you think that's an issue for a DSA that only devotes itself to, say, lumpen tenants struggle or even like a business union struggle? What are the risks of losing the revolutionary zeal from doing the opposite? Because we have pretty strong agreement on only doing the former.
I think I'm struggling to understand this question. Can you say it to me dumber?
No, the idea is basically that like we have all of these things that cause us to do reformism and liquidationism when we do
Mhm.
electoral struggle. But I'm wondering if we focus on, say, either unorganized workers or rank and file unionists in reactionary unions, we're going to be drawn towards some of the same challenges of moderating our views as the circle expands in that area compared to our circles expanding, say, in the halls of like political Capitol Dome power, if you will.
So I guess you're asking what's the difference between a reform fight in the electoral scheme versus a reform fight in a business union?
Basically, yes.
Okay. I think that our views are actually more popular than we think they are. And I think Palestine is a litmus test on that, for example, that even among conservatives, people think we shouldn't be sending arms to Israel. I think that when we're organizing in reactionary unions, um, the purpose of reforming those structures is that those are structures that are actually intended to be owned by the working class. Whereas the electoral system is not owned by the working class, and it will never be under a bourgeois state. And I think Mugg would agree with me on this. And so I think that there's a good reason to reform our unions because they're supposed to be institutions built by us for us that we hold accountable to us. Whereas the electoral system is long out of our control, and it doesn't allow us the power to hold it accountable in the ways that we would hope because our democracy isn't really a democracy. And so I see that as the primary distinction between why we should be pursuing reform efforts in a union versus not so much in an electoral space.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. I think that that really highlights what SOR's position is very clearly. I think the very last question I'm going for is Gersham's question. Is there any possibility for the existence of electoral work to grow a militant tendency within the labor movement? Can things ever work in that direction, or are we cooked?
I don't think we're
Mm,
cooked. I think there is room for an electoral project to grow a militant tendency, but I think that, again, that comes down to the kinds of campaigns that we run, and whether or not those campaigns are regularly making concessions to the ruling class. Whether those campaigns are, geared towards viability and reformism or geared towards building political consciousness, building local bases. Um, I think there's room for somebody like maybe a Daria Lisa or a Claire Valdez to help build some of the labor movement. But I think that's to be seen whether that actually works or not, right? We have to see how these people actually govern and whether or not they hold true to their principles and whether or not DSA is able to hold them accountable. So I want to say yes, but very much so on a case by case basis. And I think if we're discussing strategy, we shouldn't be building strategy on a case by case basis.
excellent. Thank you for that answer. And now we'll finally go to our final round of rebuttals for 2 minutes each. Tell me what order you want to go in. Looks like Emma is first, and we'll go to Martina, and then we'll end with Lavender.
Awesome. Well, I'll just say thank you all so much for holding this debate. I'm gonna plug the little R&R join. If you thought you agreed with what I was saying here, please check us out. I'm mostly gonna rebuttal with Alex, which I feel really bad about because it's not here, but I really agreed with a lot of what Martina was saying. I really want to bring up this point, which Martina did, is like, I think that like DSA does not actually have a great history with representing the interests of the rank and file in the labor movement. There has been some like issues there, right? At least in our electoral project. And I do think our electoral project is moving us right. And I think the reason why we should like work to bring them closer together is we need to bring electoral and drag it over to our labor work, right? Our electoral project needs to be repping our labor work much better. And I can't count like, okay, a lot of organizing conversations with my coworkers. Like, if I'm talking to my coworker and I'm trying to convince them of something, I'm going to have to kind of get over some political hurdles, right? Just with who I am and what's going on, right? There's been so many political conversations that I've been able to turn into organizing conversations, a lot around Snowrun, a lot around what's been going on. And I think the more that we're able to rep that as DSA, the more organizing conversations we have, right? I think we have to get past the like working class apathy of our political system, show that there's another way, and show that labor is highly connected to that, because that will beat the apathy we have on the shop floor. So in my view, like this is a huge task, mostly for the electoral folks. So please come work with us. And I think that's the essential thing that needs to happen in DSA. Check.
Excellent. Martina.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add. I don't disagree with Emma that electoral campaigns can be moments of inspiration or moments of political discussion among regular working class people who are picking up the New York Post for the first time and seeing, crazy stuff about DSA being what it is and having conversations about that. I think that that's largely a good thing, and we shouldn't discount it. I think my question is going to always be, how do we get people to organize beyond the electoral project? And what I mean by that is, how do we get people to do more than canvas? And I think this is true of unions as well, right? Unions participation in electoralism is very limited in scope. It rarely includes input from the rank and file and participation from the rank and file beyond get out the vote efforts. And I worry that bringing our strategies closer will do a similar thing, where instead of, people coming into DSA with a different perspective or differing perspectives of how we build power or what it means to do politics, we relegate ourselves to a realm of door knocking and canvassing in the same way that unions do. And so I would be very, very open to a different kind of electoral strategy that does more than that. That would be good for DSA, labor, and electoral to come together on.
Thank you. And we'll end with Lavender.
Yeah, I will respond first to just one small thing that Alex said, and then I think most of it's slightly more Martina. But I think some of what I was hearing from Alex was what I felt like was equating bringing the strategies closer together with having identical strategies. And to me, I think that um, I think that misinterprets, I guess, um, the relation between strategy and program. Like the same way that tactics aren't strategy. You know, strategy is the longer term of like tactics. Tactics are within strategy. And we can have different tactics that go towards the same strategy. The same way I think we can have different strategies in different areas that go towards the same program. And the program is how and the party is how we bring together different strategies in different areas. So totally agree. Like they need to be different strategies, but that doesn't mean they can't be brought together either. Um, I also agree with Martina that electoral politics shouldn't be our primary arena of struggle. And I've said I think we overemphasize it. And I think that's a reflection of I think that's like honestly a reflection of where the wider working class is because of like the general ideological function of electoral politics in bourgeois society. But once again I think the only way out is through there. I think there's a book we like in Mug called The Ballot, the Streets, or Both by August Nimtz, and I really enjoy it because it puts forward the strategy that looks to like Marx and Lenin's like approaches to electoral politics and their views there, and it kind of put forward the perspective that the purpose of our representatives in the field of electoral politics, like when we're in like bourgeois legislatures, should be to point the energy back to the streets, like back to the arenas of the organization of the working class. And I really agree with that. I do, like I said, think that there is room for reforms in our system, but it will never go past the point of reforms in in bourgeois electoral politics. Yeah, that's my time, I guess.
Thank you so much for your answers here for this final question. Clearly, the idea of electoral work gets everyone very excited as it's the thing that we're known for. And I'm going to use my chair's privilege to come firmly down on the side of electoralism in general. Tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to be hosting one last phone bank for Melat Kiros, who is running on a pro-Palestine platform for Congress in Colorado. It's fun, and I'm hoping that we can get more members and more people on this phone bank tomorrow than Hassan got on Friday. So if you are able to sign up, there is the Melat phone bank. This is a wonderful way to stay involved at DSA on a national scale. And that's why we have these debates, right? We had four comrades from across DSA who really have some ideas about how we can make our electoral work, or sorry, our labor work, Freudian slip there, stem far beyond the shop floor and really impact everything we do, not just as a constellation of chapters, but as a nationwide organization fighting for socialism in every walk of life. So thank you to everyone here that managed to stick with us through this entire 2+ hour conversation as we told the story of the future of labor. Thank you all so much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, and thanks to Mug for putting this together.
Thank
Thanks
y'all.
for
Take
being
care.
here.
I will simply close this out, comrades, unless
people want to
Yep,
stay
that
on.
works for me. Thank you.
Okay. Great job, everyone.